36.
You don't have the sloka here, Mata Prabhu. There.
Is it? Okay. Sorry about that. Natosmyaham tach charanam samiyusam babachidam swastyayanam sumangalam yo hyatmamaya vibhavam smaparyagad yatha nabha svantam athapare kutaha natosmyaham tach charanam samiyusam yusham Babachidham swastyayanam sumangalam yo hyatmamaya vibhavam smaparyagad yatha nabha svantam atha pare kutaha natosmyaham tach charanam samiyusam babachidham swastyayanam sumangalam yo hyatma maya vibhavam smaparyagad yatha nabha svantam atha pare kutaha. Please chant.
Natosmyaham taccharanam samiyusham bhavachidam swasti ayanam samangalam yo hi atmamaya vibhavam smaparyagad yatha nabha svantam atha pare kuta.
Natosmyaham tat charanam swamiyuham isham bhavachidam swastyaham swachyanam samangalam yohait atmamaya vibhavam paryagad yata nabhasanam swantam atapare kuta. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna. Natosmyaham tas charanam shamisham bhavaschidam swasti ayanam shumangalam yo he atma maya vibhavam smaparyagat yatha navaha svantam atha pare kutaha.
Hare Krishna. Nato asmyaham tachcharanam samiyusham bhavachidam swastya ayunam sumangalam yohi atma maya vibhavam samaparyagad yatha nabha swantam atha pare kutaha. Hare Krishna. Thank you.
Hare Krishna. Nato asmi aham tad charanam samyosam bhavachidam swasti ayanam sumangalam yohi atma maya vibhavam sma paryagat atha nava swantam atha pare kuto. Hare Krishna.
Anyone else? Okay. Nataha, let me offer my obeisances. Asmi, am. Aham, I. Tat, the Lord's. Charanam, feet. Samiyusham, of the surrendered soul. Bhavat chidham, that which stops repetition of birth and death. Svasti ayanam, perception of all happiness. Sumangalam, all auspicious. Yaha, one who. He, exactly. Atmamaya, personal energies. vibhavam, vibhavam, potency, sma, certainly, paryagat, cannot estimate, yatha, as much as, nabha, the sky, svaantam, its own limit, artha, therefore, apare, others, kutaha, how. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace, Abhay Charanarvinda Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. Therefore, it is best for me to surrender unto His feet, which alone can deliver one from the miseries of repeated birth and death. Such surrender is all auspicious and allows one to perceive all happiness. Even the sky cannot estimate the limits of its own expansion. So what can others do when the Lord Himself is unable to estimate His own limits? So this is Lord Brahma speaking. I should have started with that. Anyway, purport. Lord Brahma, the greatest of all learned living beings, the greatest sacrificer, the greatest observer of the austere life, and the greatest self-realized mystic, advises us, as the supreme spiritual master of all living beings, that one should simply surrender unto the lotus feet of the Lord in order to achieve all success, even up to the limit of being liberated from the miseries of material life and being endowed with all auspicious spiritual existence. Lord Brahma is known as the Pitamaha, or the father's father. A young man consults his experienced father about discharging his duties, so the father is naturally a good advisor. But Lord Brahma is the father of all fathers. He is the father of Manu, who is the father of mankind all over the universal planets. Therefore, the men of this insignificant planet should kindly accept the instruction of Brahmaji and would do well to surrender unto the lotus feet of the Lord rather than try to estimate the length and breadth of the Lord's potencies. His potencies are immeasurable, as confirmed in the Vedas. Parasya Shaktir Vididhaiva Shruyate Swabhaviki Jnana Bala Kriyacha. Shvetasvatar Upanishad 6:8. He is the greatest of all, and all others, even the greatest of all living beings, namely Brahmaji, admits that the best thing for us is to surrender unto Him. Therefore, only those persons with a very poor fund of knowledge claim that they themselves are lords of all that they survey. And what can they survey? They cannot survey even the length and breadth of a small sky in one small universe. The so-called material scientist says that he would need to live 40,000 years to reach the highest planet of the universe, being carried by a Sputnik. This is also utopian because no one can be expected to live 40,000 years. Besides, when the space pilot returned from his travel, none of his friends would be present to receive him back as the greatest astronaut, as has become fashionable for modern bewildered scientific men. One scientific man, who had no belief in God, was very much enthusiastic in making plans for his material existence, and therefore opened a hospital to save the living. But after opening the hospital, he himself died within 6 months. So one should not spoil his human life, which is obtained after many, many changes of bodies in the 8,400,000 species of life, simply for the concocted material happiness of life through increasing artificial needs in the name of advancement of economic development and scientific knowledge. Rather, one should simply surrender unto the feet of the Lord to make a solution to all miseries of life. That is the instruction of Lord Krishna directly in the Bhagavad Gita, and that is the instruction of Srimad Bhagavatam by Brahmaji, the Supreme Father of all living beings. Anyone denying this surrendering process, as recommended both in the Bhagavad Gita and the Srimad Bhagavatam, and for that matter in all authorized scriptures, will be forced to surrender unto the laws of material nature. The living entity, by his constitutional position, is not independent. He must surrender either unto the Lord or unto material nature. Material nature is also not independent of the Lord, since the Lord himself has claimed material nature as Mama Maya, or my energy, in Bhagavad Gita 7th chapter, text 14, and as Me Binna Prakritir Askadha, or my separated energy in 8 divisions. That's Bhagavad Gita 7th chapter, verse 4. Therefore, material nature is also controlled by the Lord, as he has claimed in Bhagavad Gita chapter 9, verse 10, Mayadhyakshena prakritir suyate suracharam. Sacharacharam. Sorry. Under my direction only is material nature working, and thus are all things moving. And the living entities, being superior energy to matter, have choice and discrimination either to surrender unto the Lord or surrender unto material nature. By surrendering unto the Lord, one is happy and liberated, but by surrendering unto material nature, the living entity suffers. So the end of all suffering means surrendering unto the Lord, because the surrendering process itself is bhava chiddham, liberation from all material miseries. Svasti ayanam, perception of all happiness, and sumangalam, the source of everything auspicious. Therefore, liberty, happiness, and all good fortune, that's these 3, the bhava chiddham, svasti ayanam, and sumangalam. Liberty, happiness, and all good fortune can be attained only by surrendering unto the Lord, because he is full liberty, full happiness, and full auspiciousness. Such liberation and happiness are also unlimited, and they have been compared to the sky. Although such liberation and happiness are infinitely greater than the sky, in our present position, we can simply understand the magnitude of greatness when it is compared to the sky. We fail to measure the sky, but the happiness and liberty obtained in association with the Lord are far greater than the sky. That spiritual happiness is so great that it cannot be measured even by the Lord himself, not to speak of others. It is said in the scriptures, Brahma Sokyam Tvanantam. Spiritual happiness is unlimited. Here it is said that even the Lord cannot measure such happiness. Oh. This does not mean, this does not mean that the Lord cannot measure it and is therefore imperfect in that sense. The actual position is that the Lord can measure it, but the happiness in the Lord is also identical with the Lord on account of absolute knowledge. So the happiness derived from the Lord may be measured by the Lord, but the happiness increases again, and the Lord measures it again, And then again, the happiness increases more and more, and the Lord measures it more and more. And as such, there is eternally a competition between increment and measurement. So much so that the competition is never stopped, but goes on unlimitedly ad infinitum. Spiritual happiness is anandam gurivardhanam, or the ocean of happiness, which increases. The material ocean is stagnant, but the spiritual ocean is dynamic. In the Chaitanya Charitamrita Adi Lila, 4th chapter, Kaviraj Goswami has very nicely described this dynamic increment of ocean of spiritual happiness in the transcendental person of Srimati Radharani, the pleasure potency of the Lord Krishna. The verse again, this is Lord Brahmaji speaking. Therefore, it is best for me to surrender unto his feet, which alone can deliver one from the miseries of repeated birth and death. Such surrender is all auspicious and allows one to perceive all happiness. Even the sky cannot estimate the limits of its own expansion. So what can others do when the Lord himself is unable to estimate his own limits? Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prastaya Budale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swaminata Namane Namaste Saraswate Deva Gauravani Vicharne Nirvishesha Srimani Bhari Pashchacha Deshatane Om Agnana Timirandasya Gananjana Shalakaya Chakshur Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Vanchakalpa Trubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Eva Chapatitanam Bhavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Hare Krishna. Thank you all again for joining. So in yesterday's verse, Lord Brahma was speaking, and he admitted that although he is recognized as perfect in the disciplic succession of Vedic wisdom, that he himself cannot understand the Supreme Lord, right? So he's perfect in the disciplic section of Vedic wisdom, but he cannot understand the Supreme Lord. That's what yesterday's verse said. That may come as surprising because we know that of all the Vedas, Krishna is to be known. So why is it that someone who is recognized as perfect in the disciplic succession of the Vedas cannot understand the Supreme Lord? So today that question is answered. The reason why someone who is perfect in the disciplic succession of the Vedas, which are specifically designed to help one know the Lord, cannot know the Lord. And the answer is this: that what to speak of Lord Brahma, the Supreme Lord himself cannot estimate his own limits, right? And as Srila Prabhupada pointed out in the purport, he explained it very nicely. It's not that the Supreme Lord is limited, and therefore that's why he cannot estimate his limits. It's that his limits are ever increasing. So although he can accurately measure his limits, his unlimited limits at a given moment, as soon as he's relaying that information to anyone, it's already increased. So what's the point? You can't estimate that. It's always increasing, right? Like, because generally when you measure something, it's because you want to, like, say for example, you want to make yourself a shirt, right? So you have to measure the different dimensions of your body, the chest and the length of the arms and these things, right? So you measure something because you want to, you have to, you have to put it in terms of something that you can translate, right? So it's impossible to measure the Supreme Lord because he's always expanding, right? So you can't come up with a measurement. You for a moment you can have some sort of semblance of a measurement, even though it's unlimited. But it's not only unlimited, but it's increasing, right? So for us in this material world, this seems strange because if something's unlimited, how can it continue to grow? Like infinity is infinity as far as we're concerned. It's unlimited, right? But those of us who have spent a little time in the field of mathematics, we understand that there are different magnitudes of infinity, right? If you're talking about functions, I might be boring some people for a moment. Sorry, I'm going to talk about mathematics. Anyway, so if you have this function, f of x equals x, right? You have a linear growth, which will eventually get to, it keeps going, it keeps increasing. So it's infinity, but it gets to infinity very slowly, right? So it's a small infinity. But if you have f of x equals x squared, it's exponential growth. So you're getting to infinity much quicker. You're getting to unlimited much quicker. So it's a bigger infinity, right? So if you compare those two, even though they're both infinity, one's actually bigger because it's getting there sooner and it's continually expanding, right? So the Supreme Lord, he's continually expanding. And we have 1/4 of infinity, which is the material world that's also infinitely expanding. So it's infinity, even though it's a fourth of infinity. Usually when we take a fourth of something, that means it's finite. But if the whole is infinite, a fourth of infinite is also infinite, right? And it's ever expanding. So we learned this in this chapter. We learned all of these things. So since the Supreme Lord is always increasing, although he can give a measurement because he's not limited, so he can actually give a measurement, but it won't ever continue to be accurate because he's always expanding. So this is the idea. It should also, it can be noted here that bliss or ecstasy, it can't be measured, right? The very word ecstasy, of course, it's used in different ways these days, but the origin of the word ecstasy is it means outside of oneself, right? So it's used in the context of like transcendental bliss, not just happiness, but something that's outside of its normal realm. So static means it's within confines that you can define, and ecstatic means beyond those. So bliss, actual bliss, cannot be measured. So that's something that's noteworthy at this point. So in this chapter, we have discussed the material realm and we've discussed the spiritual realm. Of course, we've talked about the nature of matter versus the nature of spirit. The nature of spirit is that it's Sat Chit Ananda. It's eternal. It's fully cognizant, fully aware, and it's full of bliss, which is also ever expanding, right? Whereas the material world, it's temporary. We experience it as temporary. It's not fully cognizant. There are many things that we just cannot perceive, and it's full of suffering, right? There may be some temporarily cessation of that suffering, which then somehow translates as happiness. But if we actually compared it to true happiness, we wouldn't actually consider it happiness at all. There's one time, early 90s, we were at a Gita Nagari used to have these like Memorial Day weekend and Labor Day weekend, they would have these seminars, a long weekend, and all these senior devotees would come and give seminars on whatever they were, studying at the time. So they'd share it with the community. So people from, New York, Philadelphia, all over would come to Gita Nagari and listen to these great devotees speak. And so during one of these weekends, we were it was the old temple room, not the new one. And there was this sound. It was like a ringing mixed with a buzzing. It was very annoying. It wasn't extremely loud, but it affected everyone in the room. Everyone had to sort of lean in so that they could hear who was speaking. And you could see that, we were all sort of like scrunched up a little bit because you're trying to sort of tune out that external noise so that you can just focus on these things. We tend to do that, right? We tend to sort of like squint and like, if we're really trying to focus on something. And so the whole room was like that. And this sound, it persisted for, 20 minutes, a half hour. nobody knew, I mean, no one in the room anyway, knew where it was coming from or how to stop it. So we just dealt with it. So we were still listening. We just had to, we had to go through a bit more in order to actually pay attention properly, actually hear and process everything. And after some time, 20, 30 minutes, the sound stopped. And it was this, you could see on everyone's face in the room that it was just the biggest relief because now we could actually hear without going through this extraneous effort, right? And so everyone was very relieved. So this removal of suffering was translated as happiness. We finally felt relieved and we we're like, oh, okay. Now we were still trapped in these material bodies, right? Which are suffering, right? We're still deteriorating. We're dying at every moment. But at least that sound was gone and we can just hear what we were trying to hear, right? So we translate these things as happiness because relative to the suffering, it is happiness. But if we compare it then, if we take its relation to actual bliss, which is unlimited and ever increasing, there's no comparison there, right? So it's all relative. It just depends on what we're comparing it to. So the happiness we find in this material world is just relative to our suffering, right? But if we compare it or relate it to spiritual bliss, we'll find that actually there's no bliss. There's no bliss in this world because it's not eternal, right? So we know from our studies that in the material world, everything goes through 6 transformations, right? It comes into being or is born. It grows, it remains for some time, it produces some byproducts, it dwindles, and it dies, right? We also know, so that's how eternity is effective, right? So it's temporary. It comes into being, it grows, it remains for some time, it produces byproducts, and then it dies. Our cognition, our awareness, our knowledge is also limited by 4 frailties. Who wants to tell me what those 4 frailties are? If anyone wants to participate today. So we talked about the 6 transformations, and there are also 4 frailties of the living entities. I don't see anyone.
Flawed senses.
Go ahead.
Imperfect senses.
Imperfect senses. Yes, that's the first one. Thank you, Bob.
Cheating propensity.
Cheating propensity.
Making mistakes.
Making mistakes. And one
And
more.
Illusion.
And illusion, right. So I'll put them in a different order. Thank you. That's perfect. So we have imperfect senses, right? So we can be looking at something. So 2 people could be looking at the same thing, and they're describing a very different thing because our senses are imperfect. Say all of us, how many do we have here? There are 3, 6, 9, 9. Okay. So say all of us are looking at a tree, and someone says, okay, how high do you think that tree is? So chances are each of us are going to have a different answer, right? They might be similar, it's 20, 30 feet, something like that. None of us are going to be accurate to the millimeter until we actually measure it, right? So imperfect senses. That's the first one. Then we have a tendency to commit mistakes, right? So even if we actually, instead of just using our senses and guessing, well, let's see, if I'm 6 feet tall and that tree looks like it's at least 3 times my height, so 18 feet is my guess, right? So even if we take out the imperfect senses, we're actually using a measuring device that we consider at least to be perfect. Then we commit mistakes. So when we're doing the arithmetic, right, and we're calculating something. So the reason that we wanted to know how high the tree is because we wanted to figure out the angle of the sun, and so we also measured the shadow, right? And so, but if we make a mistake in our arithmetic and some adding or subtracting, we'll get the wrong angle, right? So we make mistakes. I'm not even going to actually ask this because nobody will say that throughout their entire life they've never made a mistake. No one's going to say it. But if you want to, please raise your hand if you actually have never made a mistake. No one's going to do that. So imperfect senses, tendency to commit mistakes, right? So even if we took that out, right? So you could take imperfect senses out, sort of. You can at least eliminate it by using instruments that are reliable, even though our senses won't necessarily be able to reliably read these particular instruments. For example, if you have a test, no, it's not a test tube. What's it called? The one that you measure things in. It's is it a flask? Anyway, there's the one that has all the different increments of measurement on it.
A graduated cylinder.
A
Yeah.
graduated cylinder. Thank you, Prabhu. So say you're looking at a graduated cylinder and you're measuring a liquid. Well, the liquid has a meniscus. And so you have to know where to read that liquid. Some will read it from the bottom of the meniscus, some will read it from the top of the meniscus, but you actually have to read it in the middle. So you can get different readings based on those imperfect senses, even if you're using very precise instrumentation. Our imperfect senses can still read them incorrectly, right? And even if you try to take out this, tendency to commit mistakes, say you just computerize everything, right? So if things are going through a computer, the brain will make mistakes. Sure, to err is human, but if you program a machine to go through, maybe it'll make fewer mistakes, right? But so even if you do these things, which by the way, still aren't going to be perfect, we still have a tendency to come under illusion, right? So sometimes we're dealing with something we think is one thing, but it's actually something else. So even if we're precisely measuring something that we think is actually one thing, it could actually be something else. An example of this, anyone who's ever been to a magic show, we perceive things. It looks like, something is coming into being and something is disappearing out of thin air. It looks like it's not obeying the laws of physics. But there's just a trick to it. The magician knows this trick, so he's able to put you under illusion, right? And what to speak of a magician who's a human who understands just how the brain works and how he can trick it. There's then higher intelligent beings that can trick us even, easier. Then there's the tendency to cheat, right? So even if we had perfect senses, we were able to perceive everything perfectly, we never committed any mistakes whatsoever, we weren't subject to illusion, everything that we were dealing with was absolute fact, we still have a tendency to cheat, which means even though we know something is bad for us, we do it anyway, right? We see people on the street, they're smoking cigarettes, and on the package of cigarettes, by law, there has to be a statement on there from the Surgeon General that says it's bad for you. Either it'll say that it'll kill you, or it'll cause different diseases, or that birth defects, or things like that. There's always a warning. It has to be there by law. And so they know that, but they do it anyway because either, they think it's cool or they get a feel. Anyway, somehow they're cheating. They say, okay, yeah, sure. I know it's bad for me. I know it's decreasing my, but I just want to do it, so I'm going to do it anyway, right? So we have these 4 defects. So these 4 things are keeping us from full cognition, right? From having full knowledge. So we don't have full eternity because of the 6 transformations. We don't have full knowledge because of these 4 frailties. And what's holding us back from full bliss? Does anyone want to answer that one? The thing that's holding us back from full bliss, and it's actually, it's the thing that's holding us back from the eternity and the knowledge as well, is our misuse of free will, right? So since we misused our free will and we decided that we are independent from the Supreme Lord, and we were trying to, and we decided that we will try to act as such independently from the Supreme Lord. We'll control and enjoy with ourselves as the center. Since we made that decision, we exercised our free will in the wrong way. Our consciousness has become polluted. And now instead of dealing with substance or reality, we're dealing with shadow or a reflection, right? So we read about this in the beginning of the 15th chapter of Bhagavad Gita, right? We had this desire to enjoy separately from Krishna, and so now we are dealing with a reflection of reality, right? And so no matter how hard we try to enjoy something, we can't, because we're just dealing with a reflection. It may give us some semblance of enjoyment because we're seeing a reflection of something that is actually part of our nature. So there's also sort of a reflection of enjoyment sometimes, right? But it can't be fully experienced, right? It's actually tormenting because we see a reflection of something that we need, that we want, that's actually part of our nature, but we can't grab it because we're grabbing at a mirror. We're grabbing at the reflection of it, right? It doesn't have the substance. So I did mention that eternality is affected by these six transformation, and cognition is affected by these four frailties that we have. But really, these are details. The principle is that we misused our free will. So if, for example, we try to solve the problems of the material world just by addressing these six transformations or these four frailties without actually addressing the underlying principle of misusing the free will, we won't get anywhere. And we see this is what the materialist so-called scientists are doing. They can observe that, yes, we are going through these six transformations, right? They say, okay, yeah, that's true. Now we want to fix those. So, okay, birth, that's no problem because we like to exist. We like, they don't see that birth is actually a problem because birth actually means that you're misidentifying with a material body. So that's actually the problem. They don't see that though. They're like, okay, we've come into being. That's good. They like the fact that we grow, right? Because when we're born, we can't function properly and we don't know as much. We touch things that are hot that we shouldn't, and so we learn, so we grow. The growing part they have no problem with. The remaining they like, but they don't like the remaining for some time. They'd rather the remaining part continue on ad infinitum, right? And so they say, okay, so the producing byproducts, that's also good, but definitely the dwindling is bad and definitely the dying is bad. So they try to basically work backward from that. So they started with, okay, we don't like death, so let's try to fix that. And then working backward from there, they said, well, this disease is also, this dwindling part, that's a problem. So maybe if we at least stop that sooner, when you start dwindling, then, that'll fix the death. And then they realized, okay, well, that's, we can't do that either. So then they figured, okay, well, maybe it's in the producing byproducts. Maybe we shouldn't produce byproducts. Maybe that's taking something out of us. So they tried that. Or maybe we have to produce more, right? Nope, that didn't work either. So let's go back and they're now even looking into what's called stem cell research. They're trying to figure out the source of what they consider life. They're trying to figure out what that is so they could analyze it, crack the code, and just take the dwindling and the death part out of that, by doing the research on what they consider to be the origin of life. They could just fix it. They could just, genetically modify it in order to make it so we no longer dwindle and die. So these are things that are going on. This means that the materialists, they don't understand that actually the problem was our misuse of free will. The problem is birth. They're not looking at the birth problem. They're fine with that. They just want to live forever, right? But the issue is that we, who are eternal beings, we can't remain in material bodies forever because they are temporary, right? And then the same with knowledge. We try to, like I said, the cognition, we try to cheat these four frailties, right? We try to come up with more and more precise instrumentation. We try to take the human factor out of calculations. We try to say, okay, well, I'm only going to believe something that's completely tangible. Anything else will be outside of our realm, right? because we do understand that sometimes we can become illusions. So we try to deal with something that we can. Actually, I had my honors physics teacher in high school. He told us a joke one time. He said, you have these two types of scientists, right? You have like the microbiologists who they keep zooming in further and further and further and further, and they're learning more and more about less and less, right? So, and then there are these other scientists that are trying to figure out the universe, right? And so they're looking at more and more and more, and they're finding out that the more they look at, the less they know about it, because there are rules that occur in one place that no longer apply the further out you go. So these scientists know less and less about more and more, right? So the one scientist knows more and more about less and less, and the other one knows less and less about more and more. And he says, so eventually the one scientist will know nothing about everything, and the other scientist will know everything about nothing, right? So the point is when we're trying to analyze this material world, which is an illusion, we cannot be successful. We'll either know everything about nothing or nothing about everything. Either way, this doesn't help us, right? So, as Lord Brahma points out in today's verse, if we truly want to understand, we have to surrender to the Supreme Lord's lotus feet, right? Because then, instead of dealing with a polluted consciousness, if I am independent from the Supreme Lord, I am myself actually a Supreme Lord. I can control and enjoy as I wish. Instead of dealing with the material world in that sense, if we understand our true position, our true relationship with the Supreme Lord, and act accordingly, then we have access to eternity, knowledge, and bliss in full, right? We can't just try to counteract the details of our suffering, right? We have to get to the root of it. And the root of that, it's this bliss problem, the problem of us dealing with a reflection instead of reality, the shadow instead of the substance, right? So all three of these issues, the issue of temporariness, the lack of full cognition, and the lack of true happiness, they're all resolved in engaging in bhakti, in redirecting our consciousness to serve Krishna, to use our free will in the proper way. So this, talking about the nature of spirit and the nature of matter, this actually answers a question that actually Mukti Datri Mataji had a few weeks ago. She was talking about, because we were talking about the nature of the spiritual world, and she was wondering if it's possible that one might get bored there, right? And of course, her question was answered when she asked it. But this also expands on that answer. It gives a deeper or a fuller explanation of why that can't happen. Because in the material world, we go through these 6 transformations, right? And since those of us who have been here for a long time in this material world, in these bodies, we see that that's what happens. Any project that we start, it has a beginning. It grows, it remains for some time, it produces some offshoots, it dwindles and it dies, anything. And so there are different, well, before we get there, so that's what we have experience of in this material world. So we can get bored of it because we know that even though we're working towards something and we see that, okay, we're gonna reach a goal, we know that after that goal is reached, it's just gonna, that's it. It reaches a pinnacle and then it either levels off or, and gradually it falls off. And so we become bored because it's a pattern that we don't, it's not something that, it's like when a little child plays the peekaboo game, right? And at first they're very excited about it. Oh, where'd he go? Oh, there he is. Right? But after a while, it's boring. Okay, you got your hands in front of your face, man. Yeah, I know where you are. It's not that exciting anymore. You get bored of it, right? So you deal with the same thing over and over and over and over again. It gets boring. So that's how it is in this material world. In the spiritual world, everything's always increasing. The bliss is always increasing. So there's no question of getting bored because you're always learning more and more. There's no peak. It's always growing. It's always expanding. Now, there is, however, a possibility of becoming liberated and getting bored, right? And this is we know this example of those who qualify themselves to transcend the material world. So Yanis, for example, they understand that this material world is a world of suffering. They don't have information of what the spiritual world is like, but they do know that there is a place that is beyond this suffering. And they know that they themselves by nature don't belong here in the material world, but they belong in some nature. They understand it as a transcendent nature. And so if they are able to control their senses, withdraw themselves from identifying with the material body, they can merge into the Brahmajyoti, and that is considered liberation because you are liberated from the sufferings of the material world. And although there's no suffering in the Brahmajyoti, there is a sense of something more, right? So usually when it's described, it's said that the soul by nature is active. There's not really activity in the Brahmajyoti, so therefore these so-called transcendentalists, they come back to the material world, they open hospitals, they do humanitarian work like that. The real thing that they're looking for, they call it activity, but it's actually relationship, right? And one might say, well, wait, why do they say activity if it's relationship? Well, hear me out. Any activity, whether it's with something that's animate or inanimate, you have to understand the relationship. So let's say, for example, we'll just use the example of cooking, right? Because I think most of us have cooked at one point. We're dealing with inanimate objects, right? There are vegetables, there is an oven, there are pots, there are spoons, right? But if we don't understand the relationships between these things, we can't actually properly cook, right? If we don't understand that, okay, the stove is providing the heat, right? So you have to put the pan on top of the relationship is that the pan goes on top of the heat, right? That way the pan heats up and it can heat up whatever it's containing in there, right? You don't just put the spoon on there and then try to, you have to understand each of the relationships, right? What the relationships between the heat, the vegetables, the utensils. Because if you use them improperly, you're going to get a very different result, right? So any activity requires understanding of the relationship between yourself and whatever you're dealing with, even if it's not a person. So even if you are an impersonalist, you still have to understand relationship, right? Otherwise, you won't be able to understand how the things you're dealing with are working. So this relationship, of course, we understand as sambandha gyan, the knowledge of the relationship between anything. But what we need to understand is the knowledge of the relationship of us living entities and the Supreme Lord, right? That's the relationship that we need to understand. And that's the relationship that Lord Brahma is encouraging us to understand. That's what his conclusion is. His conclusion is that I have to surrender unto the Supreme Lord. And by the way, you also should, right? And this is how we do it. We take ourselves out of the center. And the way we do that is to hear from the sadhus, take the instructions of the guru, and follow the injunctions of the shastras, right? So there is no question of boredom in the spiritual world, right? There is a question of boredom in the Brahmajyoti if you don't understand relationship. But once you actually understand the relationship between you and the Supreme Lord, there's no question of boredom, right? Because it's an eternal relationship that's ever increasing. So here in the material world, generally everybody knows people who they get really, really excited when things are going their way. and they get really, really depressed when things aren't going their way, right? They have big ups, they have big downs. Things are going their way, they're very excited. Things aren't going their way, we all know those people. Now, we also know people that are just always pessimistic, right? Because they understand that although there is going to be an upward swing and there's going to be some, happiness or cessation of pain, however you want to say it, it's not going to last forever. So the pessimists, even when they're dealing at their peak, they're still focusing on the negative because they know, well, it's not going to last, right? Then you have your optimists. They're even rarer, right? They're always focused on, when things are, so even when they're down in the gutter, they're saying, okay, yeah, but in time, we're going to get back to, this happiness, right? And so the pessimists are always focusing on the down, even though they are going up and down. The optimists are always focusing on the high, even though they're both going up and down. But then we have the transcendentalists, and this is how we're supposed to be. And we learned from Sri Krishna that the way the transcendentalist understands things is matra sparshas tu kontayas utosna sukha dukkada agama payano nityas tam stitik saksha bharata. That these non-permanent appearances of happiness and distress and their disappearances in due course of time are like the appearance and disappearance of the winter and summer seasons, that they arise from sense perception, and one has to tolerate them. One must learn to tolerate them without being disturbed, right? So the transcendentalists, they're not attached to whether they're at their all-time low or their all-time high. They don't get happy when they're high. They don't get sad when they just understand that Krishna is in control. This material body is going to go through these changes, and I'm not affected by it. I just have to engage in my service, right? This is how the transcendentalist thinks. It's not how I think, but this is how a transcendentalist gets through the material world. So I'm just going to wrap this up here. So in this chapter, we thoroughly covered the natures of both spiritual and the material realms. And we understood that both of these parts, both of these realms, are just parts of the Supreme Lord's expansive form, right? And this, of course, is confirmed in the Purusha Sukta, which is why this chapter was named Purusha Sukta Confirmed. So, knowing that, understanding that, the conclusion that is given by the topmost living entity in the cosmos, who has the most direct connection to the absolute truth, who lives longer than anyone in this realm, whose facilities to enjoy comfortably are way beyond what we can even fathom, right? So this is Lord Brahma we're talking about. We may think that our lives would be better if we just lived longer, or if we had better facilities, or if, whatever the case may be. This person who is the topmost in the cosmos is giving this advice. His conclusion, which is given today, is that it's best for both him and for anyone that's listening to surrender to the feet of the Supreme Lord Hari, right? Because as long as we continue to try to enjoy material nature separately from the Supreme Lord, no matter how much piety we accumulate, we who are eternal beings, who are completely cognizant and fully blissful entities, cannot be satisfied with anything less than unceasing and ever-increasing knowledge and bliss, right? We cannot be satisfied. And that comes only when we understand, acknowledge, and act according to our actual position, right? Our actual relationship between us and the Supreme Lord. We are infinitesimal parts of the infinite Supreme Whole. So when we understand that, we acknowledge it, and we act accordingly to that, then we can actually, again, enjoy our true nature of eternity, knowledge, and bliss. All the things that we're looking for can be found just in switching our consciousness. So that's the conclusion that Lord Brahma is giving. So I went a little longer than I probably should have. So let's see if there are any questions or comments, additions, subtractions. Pranacharya Prabhu, Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna, Charachandra Prabhu. Thank you for a wonderful class. It was very informative and refreshing to hear you talk about the subject. One thing, Ravinda Sri, your spiritual master, Ravinda Sri Prabhu, he says this a lot. He talks about, does God exist? And then if God exists, is he available?
Yes.
And as we're learning through this section about the vastness of Krishna and how even Lord Brahma can't really understand and know Krishna, what to speak of us. And you explained it very nicely today, because Krishna is always expanding. He's infinite. And then we also learn about how infinitesimal we are. I guess, how are we to wrap our heads around that we can actually, that this being, this supreme being, is available to us? And then how do we take advantage of that?
So that's a great question. That's like the most important question, because it's true. If we do understand that we are infinitesimally small, then what is the hope of even understanding the infinite, right? That's the question. And the best part is that the answer, when we hear it, it should make us just immediately change our lifestyle, but it doesn't, because we have the tendency to cheat. So we are part and parcel of him. So we have the exact same qualities as him, just in a different quantity. So when we act in purified consciousness, when we purify our consciousness from this polluted state of misusing our free will, of trying to enjoy separately from him, when we bring that back to its purified state, we're tapped back in to the whole, right? We're just parts of the whole. And so that's when that experience is then perceivable, right? So when we redirect our consciousness, then yes, the infinitesimal part can understand the whole, because that's the nature. But as long as we're here in the material world, trying to figure it out with the temporary, circumstances that we have now, then it is absolutely not possible, right? So this should discourage us from trying to understand the Supreme Lord with our senses and our logic and all this, the mundane ones. But it doesn't. We still try, right? Somehow we still try, even though it's impossible, right? And even though we know that there still is a possibility if we just do this one thing, we're so attached to this idea that we can be separate controllers and enjoyers that we just won't tap into it. So as long as we don't acknowledge that, then there is no way that we'll be able to conceive of any of this. So he is certainly available. He exists, obviously, and he's certainly available. But he's available not on the terms that we come up with, right? He's available on his terms. And we can easily tap into that, right? We can easily understand him according to his terms just by following Guru Sadhu Shastra, right? But to try to say that no, if God is, if God exists, he should be available, according to my terms, that's just downright foolish, right? Because we little parts and parcels are trying to demand how God should be perceived, right? As long as we have this hubris of thinking that we are so big that, God should, change his policies so that not only should I be able to understand him and have access to him, but I should also be able to manipulate him, right? This is what we do in our prayers. We pray, "Oh Lord, please, divert this hurricane so it doesn't knock down these houses of these nice people," right? We're saying, "God, you're doing it wrong. Do it this way. I know a better way that you could be doing this." We're not seeing that the hurricane's going to knock down those houses for a reason. We don't know what it is, right? But there is a reason, and it may seem heartless, but that there's actually reasons behind everything that's going on, right? And as long as we try to dictate what should and should not be happening, we don't understand our relationship between us and the Supreme Whole, right? So that's why those who follow this process, we bring ourselves out of the center, we put Krishna in the center, we follow Guru, Sadhu, and Shastra, and then we start to see exactly how things are working. We start understanding eternality. We start understanding bliss. We start understanding knowledge, right? But if we try to do these things on our own terms, it is absolutely hopeless, right? So he is absolutely available, and it's a very simple process, but it's quite difficult for us to give up our attachment to a process that we've manufactured ourselves. Did that fully answer your question, Dronacharya Prabhu? I feel like I sort of went a little back and forth there, but is that a satisfying answer, or is there something
Yeah,
more?
no, it's very satisfying.
Okay.
And I think it's one of these, questions that keeps developing as we go
Yeah.
through our devotional life. Is, am I? So I guess it's kind of like Krishna is always available. The question is, are we making ourselves available in that
Yes.
relationship,
Yes, or you could say, are we receiving him properly? Because he's always there. Krishna's mercy is always there. But if we're not proper recipients of that mercy, then we're not really taking full advantage of it, right? It's like, the helicopter that's coming to save us from the flood, they drop a ladder down. It's there, right? But if we don't receive that, it's not going to take us away, right? If we're just sitting there and like, okay, so we have to become recipients, and that's through Guru, Sadhu, and Shastra. And this question, it'll keep coming up because we understand it. It's not a binary thing. It's not either we understand it or we don't. It's we understand it to a certain degree, and to that degree we surrender, right? But to the degree that we're still attached to the material world, we're not surrendering, right? And so we keep asking ourselves that question, and then we keep understanding more and more. Okay, all right, now I understand more. So now I'm surrendering more, but still not completely. So until we actually surrender completely, we still have to deal with some of this material suffering, right? And so it's an important question, and it's not one that you just either get answered or don't have answered. It's one that very slowly we accept the answer to, because the answer is simple, but it's just how much we actually accept and act according to that answer. So it's always important to ask that question, to discuss it with sadhus. Always, it shouldn't be that, oh, okay, I just asked that question, I shouldn't keep bringing it up. No, we should always be discussing this and discussing the areas where we feel that connection and the areas that we don't, despite these efforts. And we work with each other to resolve these issues that are holding us back to this material world. So I thank you very much for that question, and hopefully
thank you for elaborating on it.
We'll continue.
Very
Yes.
nice. Yeah.
Anything else? Yeah, okay. Yeah, and we're close to that time anyway. So I'd like to thank you all again for joining. Srila Prabhupada ki jai, Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai. All glories to the devotees.
Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namaha.
Namaha.
Jai.
Hare Krishna.
Thank you very much, Prabhu.
Krishna. Thank you.
All
It's
right.
very interesting today.
Thank you.